Welcome to Coastal Front, where we explore insights from leaders shaping our world. Today, we have the honor of hosting Tim Grant, the president of PCI Developments, a company renowned for iconic properties here in Metro Vancouver. Tim recently made a mark on Van Meg's 2023 Power 50 list, securing 35th position alongside former Coastal Front guest Ryan Beatty. With a legacy spanning over 40 years in Metro Vancouver, PCI Developments has been the creative force behind more than 70 distinctive properties. PCI has pioneered projects including Burrard Landing, where of course the famous Vancouver Convention Center is located, the Infinity Building, where you can find Sport Check near Robson Square, Black and Blue and Coast Restaurant buildings on Alberni Street, Great Northern Way, with the iconic Nemesis Coffee Building, that red curved roof, and Marine Gateway on Cambie Street, cross-secting with Southwest Marine Drive. Currently, their innovative pursuits continue with major projects like the Granville Broadway Corridor, Marine Gateway 2, and Ontario N 4th. In this episode, we're going to discuss transit-orientated housing, rental housing solutions, and we'll take a look at housing supply and affordability from the lens of a developer. Tim, it's a pleasure to have you on to Coastal Front. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into those hot topics of transit-oriented housing and purpose-built rental housing, for the listeners and viewers who might not be familiar with the PCI brand or PCI development, can you tell us a little bit more about your company?
Yeah, well, thank you. And so we're at PCI. I think we're maybe most known for the orange signs. We're probably not great on marketing, but we're good at getting signs up, and they've got the very distinctive orange. So you hopefully see some of those around the region. We were founded in 1982. My dad, with a group of partners, founded the company in 1982. So being over 40 years in our business, focused in Vancouver, I think that's something we're really proud of. And I think a big focus for us is mixed use, and maybe different than some of our peers in the industry. Approximately 50% of what we do is commercial, 50% is residential, which, in the Vancouver marketplace, condo housing is predominantly most of what we know about with our developers. So I think that's an element, and the ability to mix those uses where we can, particularly on transit, is a big focus for us.
I have noticed that when looking at your portfolio, and I love mixed-use buildings. There's something really attractive about them, and I'm assuming there's got to be some core sort of community benefits too for having mixed-use buildings. Do you want to quickly touch on why mixed use is of interest to PCI, why you guys have chosen to kind of specialize in that space, or you maybe have an interest in it?
I think it goes back to probably mid-90s, late 90s, in that a rapidly urbanizing city like Vancouver, the opportunity for mixed use, and I think the attraction for mixed use to people, particularly in the downtown, and maybe learning from some of the things that our team had seen in places like Hong Kong, and feeling that was where the world was going to be going. And that's really been a big focus for us the last 25 years. At that time, things like sustainability maybe weren't noted as the big benefits. I think certainly that's generally accepted today, that enables us to achieve a lot of our sustainability goals. I think it's creating vibrancy and energy that people want to be a part of. So I think mixed use is really what makes our cities great, and where people want to be. Yeah,
I agree. Now, obviously, for my introduction, you guys have a long history of some really iconic buildings here in Vancouver, but you've also got projects in sort of in play right now in various stages. Are there any particular projects, one or two, that you can speak about that you're very excited about?
I think where we are today, housing is I think top of mind for everybody, and commercial is a big part of what we do. Obviously the office world is a bit in flux right now. We are still very committed to building office space where we can, and I think we're very optimistic in terms of what the world looks like. Although the office market is going to be different than maybe the way it was 10 years ago, but we certainly think there's real opportunity there. But I think today rental housing is really top of mind for everybody. We have over 3,000 rental units under construction or under application in the city of Vancouver, a large portion of which are in close proximity to transit. And then we've got another over 1,000 units, again, under construction or under application in two municipalities, Port Moody and our big project in Surrey, King George Hub at King George Station. And I think that that element, that opportunity for scale on transit, is something we're really excited about.
Okay, great. Well, we might be able to revisit those as we get into some of these topics questions around transit-oriented housing and rental purpose-built housing. One of the things I want to ask you about is Warrington PCI. What is that?
That's our sister company, and so they're a property manager, and we're very proud that they are the largest commercial property manager in the province. And
Really?
yeah, so anybody that has some commercial property management needs, we know that the team at WPM would love to talk to them.
Okay.
And they manage a lot of our completed developments, and we think that opportunity to kind of be with them through the operation of the buildings is really important.
What when you say completed developments, what would you when you look at the total history of 40 years, do you ever kind of calculate like how many square feet or how many units you've built? I don't even know how you would describe that metric.
Well, and going back to the bad marketers, I think a lot of people have that metric or that square footage available. We think it's somewhere over 8 million square feet.
Wow.
And I think the bigger thing is if you were to sit around with the team, I think everybody gets a very personal relationship with the projects. And you know, and I think that's a big part of our business and the way we approach the developments is absolutely there's a financial angle, but there's a real emotional kind of into the detail aspect that I think is a big part of our culture.
Okay. Well, let's get into the transit-oriented housing topic. Vancouver's urban vision emphasizes a reduced car dependency. While developers like PCI aim to contribute to this vision through transit-oriented developments, they often face significant hurdles due to local government approvals and policies. And obviously, you know, not exclusively for PCI. This is something you hear from a lot of real estate developers here in Vancouver is the challenges of working with government, largely municipal or local government. How does PCI Developments approach a transit-oriented project? I know it's kind of a broad question, but do you have a particular approach you take to this?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting and unique about transit, particularly in a region like ours that is a relatively strong user of transit, and I think that's being shown coming out of COVID. I believe Metro Vancouver is number 1 or number 2 in terms of a return to transit use, and I think that's a good indicator of how important transit is in our region. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with a public interest in that infrastructure. You're dealing with a senior government interest in that infrastructure, so it's adding additional stakeholders, and I think it's adding additional expectations in terms of what those projects are ultimately going to look like. And so that there's some opportunity there. You know, we look at what has happened with South Granville Station, for example, that I think the community resoundingly felt that there was a need for more than just what was provided under the old zoning there. And that was something the provincial government was behind, the city ultimately got behind, and I think that's a really good example. You know, the other side is that there's an accountability to those projects, that if you don't deliver, you need to be optimizing that infrastructure the best you can. And so we try to be very mindful of that too.
So the South Granville project, let's use this as a good example. This is on the corner, I think it's the northeast corner of Burrard Street. Granville Street and Broadway. Yep. Okay. So it used to be where the Royal Bank used to be there. People would know if there's a Royal Bank there. So how big of a project is that, and what's being built there? So
what's being built there is there's going to be ground floor retail and the station entry to South Granville Station, which is unique in that we're delivering really the station box that the train is going to be connecting into at that corner. On the second floor, there's going to be a Loblaws City Market grocery store, which was a really important element that neighborhood frankly doesn't have, you know, kind of walking access to a first-run grocery store like that. Above that will be 100,000 square feet of office. You know, and right now we don't have any tenants. So again, you know, that's a very prominent space and a good west side location. But and then above that is all rental housing. And 20% of those rental housing units will be secured for moderate income households. So it's about 240 units in total. And we think that's a really important opportunity, that there's height and there's density being offered by the city, but I think it's density that's really responsive to the needs of the city today.
Wow. So theoretically, someone could actually live in that building, work in that building, and go grocery shopping in that building.
Absolutely, and get on the train when they're going and visiting their friends. Yeah, no, okay. Exactly. That's the model user for sure.
So it does seem like a real great model to work from. And one of the things that surprised me when we spoke before this interview was that there are other stations that don't have any kind of infrastructure built like this. It's literally just a station. What are your views on that?
Well, I think it's a lost opportunity for sure. And if you go back historically, how transit infrastructure has been delivered, there's never really been a thought about the adjacent development. And going back to the Expo line, which is relevant to our King George Station project, we bought the King George site over 10 years ago. It was a large surface parking lot right adjacent to a terminus station that really just had people commuting daily, jumping on the train, coming downtown. Fast forward to the Canada line, where so this is kind of early 2000s when they're planning, that there was very limited thought about what that would do to land use and demands. And we look at our Crossroads development, which was kitty corner to City Hall Station. The city at that time held us precisely to the height and density that existed at that space for some time.
Yeah.
Canada line open, I think it was a large success. Everybody, I think, is well aware of how strong that ridership has been. And the city was almost kind of presented with this thing that land use is going to dramatically change. People want to live at these stations. People want to work at these stations. They want to shop at these stations. And so that led into our Marine Gateway project, where it was built as an integrated project after the fact. So, we've got a picture of us with our 6th level excavation right adjacent to an operating station, which I think was, very anxious times for everybody, but that's what had to be done with the opportunity that was presented by that station. Thankfully today with the Broadway Subway project, the city's been, I think, a bit more forward-looking in terms of what the Broadway Subway is going to do for land use. One of the challenges with that is that they went through a very long planning process that was sidetracked a bit by COVID. And so led to the situation where we're in a Broadway and Granville where they kind of had to figure it out to not get in the way of the train construction. So ultimately, 2 of the 6 stations are going to be built with integrated development. Both of them are ours, one at South Granville and then one at Great Northern Way Emily Car Station.
Is that also your project?
It is, okay. Yeah. And we think those are going to be really, really exciting stations, world-class stations. When we look around the world, that integrated development is a really important part of kind of those iconic communities that people know about.
But just to make sure I'm clear here, so there's going to be 6 new subway stations built with this Broadway subway plan. Where does the first station start?
The first station is VCC Clark, which is there today.
Yeah.
Will extend to Great Northern Way Emily Car Station, which is at Great Northern Way in Thornton.
And that's the first of the 2 integrated buildings that you've got.
Yeah.
And then the next station after that?
Main Street. So
Main Street?
Yeah, the Main Street station, which is being built by the province, kind of independent of any development.
Okay.
And then you move towards Broadway and Cambie, which will be tied in with the existing Canada Line station.
Okay.
And our Crossroads project. And then you go to Broadway and Laurel, which is VGH, and again being built independently by the province.
Yeah.
And then we go to Broadway and Granville, which will be ours and integrated.
Yeah.
And then all the way out to the current terminus, which is Broadway and Arbutus.
Okay.
And Broadway and Arbutus is really interesting because hopefully that's kind of a short-term terminus, because I think we'd all hope that it's going to get out to UBC.
Yeah.
It should get out to UBC soon.
Of course. Yeah. It's crazy not to.
Yeah.
But just to make sure I'm clear, so you're saying that out of the 6 stations that are going to be built, only 2 are going to be what we described as integrated stations, where you've got shopping, office, residential building space, and the other 4 is just a station.
Yes, and there'd be provisions for like what we did at Marine Gateway, where the developer could come in after the fact and try and integrate it, which is challenging, particularly in a constrained urban environment. So I think.
So, I'm going to say it because you may not want to, but I'm going to say this seems like a foolish approach to things. Like, when you described to me your Marine Gateway, like, I'm glad you guys pulled that off, and it's a beautiful area. So, drive down there and it's a bustling little like mini village within the city. But the fact that you had to build it after the fact, imagine just engineering wise alone would be very challenging. So who's making, or who are the people who are not making the right decisions here? Is this municipal government that's making the call to let these buildings, these other 4 stations that don't have any integrated facilities carry on, or is it the province, or who's making the calls here?
I think it's a combination of both. I think in the case of the Broadway subway, that the province's focus rightly is making sure they're delivering that really important infrastructure. And the city needs to catch up in terms of land use decisions. And I think increasingly there's an awareness of the need for those to be very closely coordinated. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm hopeful that projects like our South Granville one have really brought that to light. So I know that the city is really active on planning for the future UBC extension, trying to get ahead of it best they can with integrated development being a real goal. And I think that's what maybe people don't appreciate is that there's actually some really strong people at the city level and also the provincial level that are really working hard on transit and the importance of not only deliver that infrastructure, but the associated development.
Yeah.
And that's been really great in our world to see in probably the last 5 years that the focus and the expertise on those teams has really picked up, and they're very actively engaged with guys like us.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, you're being a lot more pleasant about it than I would be. I mean, as far as my critical view is concerned, I mean, to me, this concept of integrated buildings on each station is just like a no-brainer. I don't know. It's not rocket science. It makes sense. You've got a brand new major terminal being built. You should have shopping and office space, and I mean, maybe even industrial. I don't know, but I'm glad you guys are leading the way on that. You mentioned earlier about the crossroads, and my question was going to be around the lack of foresight when it comes to zoning. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that back at that time, which would have gone back to probably 2006 or so.
Yeah, right in there. Yeah.
Not too bad on my time.
Yeah, exactly.
So, 'cause it was built for the purpose of getting the line built to the airport for the Olympics.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like what you were saying is at the time, the government of the time in 06 wasn't willing to kind of like allow you to build higher and bigger with crossroads. So let's just be clear, this is where the Whole Foods is, and there's also a Royal Bank, I think, on the other end of that corner, and there was I think it was a Milestones at a short life up above. And is there housing above that as well?
There is.
Okay.
And anybody who wants to do kind of the real estate history of Vancouver, it's actually a really interesting example because it's kitty corner to what is going to be, call it outside of Waterfront Station, that the real hub of transit. It's got two connecting major lines now.
Yeah.
And we were precisely held to the height at that time at Broadway, so it's a relatively short building.
How many floors is that building?
It's the residential building. I believe is off Broadway is only about 4 stories.
That's nuts.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
When we had to have a bit more of an exemption, and it's a bit of, it's a funny site because there's a bit of slope to it. But you go out there today and you're kind of like, it seems underbuilt.
Yeah, it does.
But this is only, call it 15 years ago, and I think it's been really dramatic how the acceptance of transit and then the desire for it to be a part of people's everyday lives has changed. And that test reinforces the need to get it right. I mean, that was a big part of the discussion through South Granville project and the city's Broadway plan, is that absolutely there are pressures today that maybe make this uncomfortable, but this is really precious infrastructure that's going to serve us for a long period of time.
Yeah.
You really got to make sure you get it right.
You got to get it right. Absolutely. So with respect to that concept of of lacking foresight, is there anything that you're dealing with here in Vancouver proper with respect to these projects or other ones you're working on, where you're banging your head against the wall, going, "Man, these zoning bylaws in the city are not in tune with 2023 right now. That should get changed," and that maybe someone like Ken Sim, who's been on Coastal Front, know Ken quite well, would want to be hearing from a developer like yourself.
Yeah. Well, and we try to be very diplomatic, but there's no way around. I mean, the city approval process is way, way too slow.
Yeah.
And I think
I think everybody knows that.
I think
it's not like you're the only guy saying that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think one of the things that Mayor Sim's done really well is really put the pressure on it and be asking why. And our limited dealings with him and that party, there's been a lot of just, okay, why is it this way? Can we do it better? And I think if we were to encourage anything, I think it's just really focusing around that process. For the person probably not involved in it day to day, a lot of it would just seem crazy. I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement there, which will lead to better outcomes. And I think even just, the cost of these projects alone would be helped significantly by improving the time, improving the approval certainties, which over time should help supply and in turn, hopefully stabilize our housing costs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I read a report somewhere which suggested that, I'm going to throw out a number, you tell me if this is right or not, but something like 20% or 25% of the cost for a developer like PCI to go and build an integrated building on one of these stations is attributed just to local planning efforts and time delays of having to wait to get approvals. Is that a fair statement? Is it?
I mean, it's certainly significant costs. I mean, the one that stands out to my mind also is the fees and things like that. And I think various industry groups have done some studies, and somewhere between 30 and 35% of a housing unit is wrapped up in city fees and extractions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really
are these
big
in addition? You're including in this these what are called, I think, community contribution. What are they called? CACs.
Yeah, in the city of Vancouver they call them CACs, community amenity contributions.
Community amenity contributions.
Yeah, and it's development cost charges and all the various fees that we application fees and water connection fees and all these things. So it does add up. It's a really significant element of it.
But I mean, all that goes, if you're building housing, for example, I mean, that just gets passed on. I mean, it's either comes out of your pocket or it comes out of the home buyer's pocket or a little bit of both.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everybody in this business, no matter how much they want to be committed to what they're building, they have to build something that's going to be worth more than it's going to cost to build.
Right, of course.
And so any of those things, ultimately leads to that.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I love having guests like you on, is because the reason we've started Coastal Front in the first place is, culturally here in Canada, we seem to want to vilify success stories and people who are doing big things. And if they make a profit by doing it, good for them. That's my view, at least. I think it's great. And I think it encourages other young people to take a similar approach to take some risks, put some money on the table and see what you can pull off. But of course, we do have a lot of people in our society here in Canada, and especially on what I like to describe as the hippie West Coast, where we almost get angry over people that the sort of the view of these developers, they're just profit focused first. And when I look at the work that you're doing, I mean, you mentioned this one project where it's a rental on Broadway and Granville. You've got a lot of rental housing there, much of which is going to be, what did you describe it as, below?
The city calls it moderate income.
Moderate income.
Yeah.
So can you maybe comment as to to help listeners? I mean, I know our listeners are probably aligned with you and I, but for those who maybe be critical and go, these developers are just in for make a buck. I mean, obviously, like you said, you've got to produce something that's worth more than it costs you to build. Otherwise, why would you do it? But can you maybe expand a little further to help address this myth that you guys are just profit driven only?
Yeah. Well, and I think, to be honest, I think it's a fair comment in that we're in a housing environment that's extremely challenging. Mm-hmm. And I think not recently, but there was a period of time where the industry needed to work on some of the messaging about being aware of that and understanding the challenges. And I think we've crossed in a different space that I think everyone is recognizing that this is such a big issue, and there's a real renewed focus around rental housing, ideally opportunities for below market housing. So I think the industry in general has done a better job of trying to be responsive to those issues that are very real and facing our community. They're a huge constraint to our economy. I mean, that there's I think it's just the most pervasive issue we're dealing with right now. Mm-hmm. So I think that I think the opportunity for the industry to jump in and try and be a part of the solution is really important. I think you're seeing groups trying to do that. And in our world, that is really focused around rental housing. But I think some of the condo guys are also, mindful of opportunities to be help in that regard. So I think there's a real opportunity for the industry to be a part of it. I really hope that the powers that be in government, recognize that to address this issue, everybody has to be firing on all cylinders in building housing. Yes. It's not going to be a public housing exclusively solution. It's not going to be a private housing exclusively solution. Yeah. And we just, I think no matter what philosophy or ideology you approach it from, supply is a part of the solution. It might not be the 100%, but it's certainly a big part of the solution.
I completely agree with what you're saying, Tim. I mean, to me, I'm a free market capitalist, and I just firmly believe that most things in life are solved by letting the market find its way. And what I see as being a big problem is we just haven't allowed both large developers like you, right down to the single family, single builder that's just doing one family home at a time, and everybody in between, just let these projects get approved. Maintain very high standards, because we don't want us to look like, some third world country, and we want to make sure that projects are completed with proper type housing that people can live in safely. But let's get them approved, get them going, because it seems like, we know this Metro Vancouver, and Vancouver in particular, has a huge influx of migration, not from just abroad, but even just internally from our own province. Like, you've got people coming from small towns where I grew up in, other cities, and we got to address it. Like, we've got to get ahead of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize the real significant opportunity Vancouver has. I mean, obviously, we are very fortunate to live here. There's lots of fantastic things about Vancouver, but we also have an acute housing need that provides a market that we can address a lot of our issues through leveraging that market. Mm-hmm. And so if there are city priorities, economic, community, social, let's get them on the table. Let's work with more profitable uses, like in most cases, housing, to try and address those needs. And it doesn't need to all go back to the public sector to try and solve every problem. And, and I think if we can really work on our processing times, approval times, approval certainty, there's a real opportunity for the private sector to step in and try and continue to be part of the solution. And I think there's a lot of really good community attributes around the region that have been delivered in working closely with private development. In our little world, that's some of the station infrastructure, that's certainly some of the community facilities. Daycare is a big one today. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the private sector to continue to expand what they do and working with the city to relax some of those requirements to make it feasible.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. With respect to potential home buyers, is there any particular policies, either at the provincial or federal, but most likely at the municipal level, like very specific policy that you could see being changed that would make it a little easier for home buyers to get access to affordable housing in our city?
Well, I think the one that we're dealing more with today is rental housing, and I think one of the reasons why that's really important is aside from the regular carrying cost of buying a home, the down payment is huge. And it's such a barrier, and I just don't think as a city we can be trying to be a vibrant, inclusive, economically supportive place with such a high barrier to housing. The other thing that the cities and the province talked about is things like the affordable home ownership programs. So can you have housing that's maybe structured in a way that people can be working their way into? The city and the province could play a role in that. That's something that we've talked about with them over the years. And again, going back to that idea that there's an opportunity for some collaboration to address some of these issues. All those ideas are good ones if we can have a straightforward path to be able to build some of these buildings and do the types of things that the communities want to see. Yeah.
Okay. You've mentioned rental housing quite a bit, and that was the second topic that I wanted to get into. So let's talk a bit more about that specifically, and we can always jump back to the transit-oriented housing. It seems to me, from what you're telling me, actually they're integrated. I mean, your project on Broadway and Granville is both. It's transit-oriented and it's rental housing. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. Very much so.
I'm curious to know, if I put myself in your seat. You've got a piece of land, maybe it's on a transit line, and you're trying to decide, you and your planners, on what to build. I'm going to dumb this down to real simple. Like, we have an option to build a bunch of strata units, like condos that we can sell to the market, or we can build a bunch of rental housing that we can then, I guess, you sell it to like an insurance company or a pension fund, and then or you keep it yourselves and you rent it out. How do you kind of like make that decision? Like, what kind of goes into that decision-making process?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, I think condo development on a profit on cost basis is more lucrative. You have a cash event at the end of the project. It's relatively assured because you've done your pre-sales, but you have no continuing involvement in the income stream from that investment. Okay. Whereas rental housing, more probably your guys' world, from an institutional perspective, is a very attractive investment, or private capital or whatever that might be. So it's a stable, relatively low risk return, but it's a very low going in return. Yeah. And so it takes a different investor profile for sure. The institutional investor in Canada, I think, is a big part of the opportunity of rental housing. Is in the last 10 years, coming out of the global financial crisis, that there's been a recognition of the potential for a stable, relatively low risk investment in rental housing, but particularly in Canada's major markets that were extremely undersupplied. And I think sometimes that institutional investor gets vilified in that rental housing conversation, which would be completely counterproductive to the role they do play in establishing more supply and a very high quality rental sector.
Yeah. Are you seeing a shift at all in, say, the interest of institutional investors today with higher interest rates? Like, is that become a factor, both either negative or positive?
I think there's caution, maybe more because of the broader kind of macroeconomic story, maybe less just because of interest rates themselves. And no question, interest rates are making investment cases harder and harder to make. That it's more challenging. It's a significant increase to a very important cost.
Yeah.
But I think that the principles are remaining the same, and I think just the good real estate investment principles are remaining the same. Is that a stable, high quality investment in well located places, and I think this same very much holds true for the office market. We built a new building at 601 West Hastings, so Hastings and Seymour, just across from Waterfront Station, and it was about going into COVID. It could have been leased a few times over. We had a big change in COVID, so today, about 18 months after completion, it's just almost 50% leased.
Oh wow! Yeah, and I've heard the office space is it's a tough market right now.
Yeah, and it's a great building and a great location, and absolutely would love to have it fully leased on day one, and we certainly intended to do that.
Yeah.
But over the long term, we think it's going to be fine, and it's well located real estate, high quality amenities, attractive attributes that we think in kind of this short term period, it's going to come out of it and be just fine. And I think that's very similar for the case for rental housing.
Okay. When it comes to the rental housing option versus condos, is there any incentives being offered to developers like you today to go and lean towards a rent? Like if you ran the math and your accountants on your team are like, hey, Tim, like this is a great property. We're not going to make as much if we do rental housing as if we did a condo. Is there any kind of incentives to kind of swing you towards the rental direction by government to help you with that?
Yeah, it is really, really important that they're there. So the city of Vancouver hadn't really done a lot of that until about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And they started adding in a situation where you could build additional density for rental housing. So in simple terms, you could take a building that you could build 4 stories of condo, and they would able to build you would be able to build 6 stories of rental housing.
Okay.
That was still financially would still weight towards condo, but it was close enough that you could start to make those decisions. And so we had a few of those that we were able to push towards rental housing. So that additional density is really important. And I think through Broadway and the Broadway plan, there's an element there that says if you're going to build rental housing, you can build this. If you're going to build condo, you can build that. And the rental housing is generally higher density, which is really important to make it work. The other thing that's really important in the rental housing space, and particularly with some of the below market housing, is CMHC. And they've got some financing programs that are very favorable if you're willing to include some below market housing.
Okay.
And in the recent years, that's been a big part of facilitating a lot of the projects that you've seen.
So that's good. That's good that these policies are around to kind of help provide that market, because otherwise I could see it if I was in your shoes. Like, why would I build rental housing if I'm going to make a lot more on the condo space?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this month, Premier David Eby, also a 2-time guest on Coastal Front, was quoted on X, which is formerly Twitter. He said that the only way to tackle the housing crisis is to build more housing faster. We need everybody at the table and use every tool. That's why I'm thankful for the federal government to have responded to our ask to eliminate GST on new rental construction. So my simple question is, this announcement, which I think most people took note of, seemed like a big announcement. I don't know if it actually is really material. That's why I'm asking you. Is this a material event? Is this eliminating GST? And of course, with Trudeau government, I'm pretty critical of him. I mean, it's always devil in the details, right? So I don't even know how, what entails this elimination of GST and what doesn't. What is your view on that announcement?
It is very significant.
Okay.
And it's been a conversation that's been going, I was joking with my father that he remembers being on a delegation that went to Ottawa on it almost 30 years ago, and so I think it's been a progressive campaign since then. So very much credit to the federal government for making that move today. It's been talked about for a long time, and it is, very high dollar values in terms of savings. in our little world, we had a 55-unit rental apartment building on East Hastings at Boundary that was frankly infeasible to move forward. We really wanted to do it, but we were just a little bit offside on where we needed to be. This announcement changes that. So we're going to be able to get that project started in the next month or so.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so that's just, and I think there's developers across the country that probably have a similar story. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely material.
Well, if there's any politicians listening to this podcast right now, there's a good example of a builder. Like clearly the margins aren't that thick if like 5% is going to lean towards whether a project goes ahead or not. So it's nice to see that they have recognized that, cutting taxes can actually spur on the economy. Who would have thought? Last week, Mayor Ken Sim, who also has been on Coastal Front, also quoted on X, formerly Twitter, he said, "We're taking bold action to address this housing crisis. Tonight, we took a huge step forward to increase housing attainability and build more homes faster by allowing multiplexes across all low-density residential zones in the city of Vancouver." Now, I know you're not probably in the business of multiplexes. You're building much bigger than that. But being that you've been in the building industry largely your whole working life, even when growing up as a kid doing that, what is your view on this little policy by our local government to allow multiplexes across all low-density residential zones?
Well, yeah, and I certainly, I mean, that's maybe not directly our world, but I can say that on one hand, it's going to be relatively small in terms of the pace of change. You're kind of dealing with a few units there, which is great. And I think we just also point that it's really important with that more dramatic change can happen on the larger, more urban sites where you can get a lot more units in a single place. But I think the thing that Mayor Sam is doing extremely well, I also think Premier Eby and his colleagues in the province are doing well, is setting the tone for what the expectation is that it's very clear that housing's a priority. We want to move quickly. Particularly the province are increasingly picking up the pace with making it very clear what the expectation is. Mm-hmm. And that's giving, I think, the cover for municipal politicians and a couple of the communities we deal with that really matters is when their constituents are saying, well, this feels like a lot of change. They can point to the province and be saying, no, like this is best practice. This is what we need to be doing. Yeah. And I really hope that the province and Mayor Sim and their group can keep that messaging up, because I do think that's making a difference and making its way through at the municipal staff level as well. Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems to me that that's what we need to see happen, because I mean, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors per se, but like when I think of the messages you hear from both the federal Liberal and Conservative and NDP, I mean, they all say we need more housing. Provincially, they all say that. The BC United, David Eby and the NDP, and Ken Sim and the ABC Party. And it seems like this challenge sits inside the bureaucrats that run the actual city more than anything else. Yeah. And so it sounds like what you're saying is like, if we got that political messaging coming from all three levels of government, it's going to kind of put pressure on those people working at the city to basically move faster
and having some accountability to it. Right. This application sat here for 3 years. Like that there isn't a municipality probably in the world that would have that be the norm. But the reality is that that's a very normal occurrence here. Yeah. And there's a real opportunity to pick up the pace. Yeah.
A lot of people who we do these podcasts and get feedback on are critical over the word affordability. We had a good chat about this with Bob Rennie, and his view was that one of the challenges that we face in Metro Vancouver is that each municipality is kind of trying to do their own thing, and it needs to be a more broader Metro Vancouver sort of strategy applied, because most people will work in one municipality and live in a different one. Tim, one of the questions that I want to ask is about what is affordable housing, because when I talk to the young people who work for me, these are people making anywhere from $70,000 to $100,000 a year. And as you said earlier, that you've got to come up with this massive down payment. I mean, even though the condo sector, as far as I understand, is kind of softened a bit here in downtown Vancouver, I mean, you're still looking at like north of $700,000 for a tiny little box. So Do you have any thoughts around this sort of wording? Because it seems like you almost bring it up with certain people and they get like really agitated. It's like, that's not affordable, which probably is true.
I agree. Like, and I think it's about relative affordability in our region. And unfortunately, we are living in a region that the housing cost is out of, has lost connection with local incomes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think hopefully we're going to see some income growth, and the economy is a big part of that for sure. But normalizing the housing cost is critical.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it goes back to that supply conversation.
Right.
And I think what has happened is the reverse of probably what people want. Call it the last year or 2 years, we've seen the rental market just continue to escalate because we're in a very constrained supply market. And in the case of Vancouver, it's not just about how much it costs. It's even having the opportunity to rent housing, period. Like it's not the case where there's always vacancy in these buildings. We're going through a lease up right now in the Hastings and Boundary area in Vancouver. And again, the building's oversubscribed. And it doesn't feel good to be on the landlord side in that situation either.
Yeah. Where you're having to turn away tons of people is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then and again, the rents are challenging in this context. It's the rents we need to be able to make these projects viable. I mean, it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah. Well, it's one of my other criticisms is this rent increase cap that the provincial government has put into place. Well, I do really like what David and the BC NDP have done in some ways in trying to push forward approving more housing projects. They've also put these limits in, and I think if I was an investor, I would not want to invest in rental properties today because like I can't increase my rents by more than 2% a year, and inflation's far higher than that. And what's interesting, if you look at that CMHC report that comes out every January, which is the rental housing report, you probably read it. What's fascinating is even though it shows you that doesn't work, because even though there's landlords out there that can't increase their rent by more than 2% a year, the average rental property last year in 2022 that became vacant and then reopened for a new renter to come in went up by 42%.
Yeah.
So you almost have like this like 80 to 90% of the population that generally any given year don't move, because people don't move homes every year. So, got 80, 90% of the population that don't move, and they just see their rents go up by no more than 2% a year. And I would assume that causes investors to go, well, I'm not going to put any more money into my property. So now you're going to have more decrepit buildings that start breaking down. They're not being, yards aren't being taken care of, walls aren't being painted, carpets aren't being changed. And then you've got this small amount of movement where renters leave, and then it's almost like the landlords have to future-proof their rents by almost asking more than they should for today, just to protect themselves for the fact that for the next 5 years, they might not see their rents go up by more than 2% a year.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And we're seeing it firsthand. I mean, this past month, we've had the lowest turnovers in the rental buildings that we've seen in recent memory.
Right.
Because people know that they're sitting in rents that are well under market.
Yeah.
But in turn, that's now reduced the amount of available supply for people they're looking for new homes.
Yeah.
So, it's a really challenging situation. I think that the rental growth increase is a really important thing, because it's not just about the rent that's going into a landlord's pocket, but it's the one that's covering expenses. And I think it's been well documented how much inflation has, been an issue all the way through the economy. That the one thing I would point out and just give a bit of kudos to the City of Vancouver has a housing department. And one of the things that we jumped into working with them on was this moderate income housing. And they brought out what they called a pilot program a few years ago to kind of try a program to do that. And one of the deals is that they would refine it over time to try and address those issues. One of the things that they found was that they were too rigid on how those moderate income rents could be inflated.
Okay.
And so they're updating that this fall to try and be responsive to that. And I think for them and the typical bureaucracy of what a city could be, for them to follow through with that and be responsive to the market conditions, I think is a really important thing. So guys like us can be like, okay, we had faith in this program before. They followed through in saying what they were going to do. We're going to keep trying to be really focused on doing some of these things. And if they weren't able to do that and refine these programs, it'll be hard, as you say, for us to keep kind of investing in that. And I think that's hopefully a good learning across all levels of government, is just to stay on top of it and keep refining as we go. And it all can't just be absolutes.
Well, it's nice to hear that you're getting that kind of reception from City Hall. So it sounds to me like Mayor Sim and his team are changing the culture there. So that's great. I had the pleasure of having Ryan Beatty on. I'm sure you know Ryan. He's a pioneer, and his dad was as well, in the industrial space. Now, I know you have a view, and I'd like to hear, I have our listeners listen to this, about how we can integrate industrial real estate. I mean, we talked, for example, your Broadway and Granville corridor there. That project is a combination of obviously the subway line, Loblaws grocery store. You've got some office space, and then you've got some rental housing above. But we haven't talked about industrial. And one of the things I've observed as a very long time resident here in Vancouver is how our industrial real estate's getting pushed out further and further and further from the Vancouver downtown core, which I got to think is going to have some problems to do with is going to be some challenges economically for us. I don't know. What are your views on industrial real estate, and how do you integrate that into places where people also want to live?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, probably a less publicized, call it crisis, but we have an industrial land issue, and I call it an industrial space issue. And one of the things that underpin Vancouver's real estate market, it's just constrained land supply. You know, we have a border, we have the ocean, we have the mountains, and you've got a relatively small region to fit a lot of activities in that space. So from an investment perspective, that's been a barrier to entry. But from a competing interest for land supply, it creates some challenges. And historically, that the residential land use has been pitted against industrial land and the ALR. And then you add in transit, which typically gets put into industrial areas because of the railway corridors and things like that really changes that dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So we believe there's a real opportunity to be thinking about them as complementary, not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And the city of Vancouver particularly has been really focused on them being completely separated, and you can't have the two together for a long, long time. And we're hopeful that mindset's starting to shift, and that we don't really have a choice anymore. You know, our land has got to work hard, and there's a real opportunity to use the residential density to support the really high infrastructure requirement that industrial has.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in a really specific example, there's 4 stations, transit stations in the city of Vancouver that up until the last year or so were precluded from residential uses by a regional growth strategy. Regional Metro Vancouver has now updated that strategy. They pointed out that there's a real opportunity for housing, particularly rental housing at these stations, to be done in conjunction with the job space. And, you know, we look at our Marine Gateway, we've got a big movie theater at Marine Gateway, so we call it Marine Gateway 2, very original idea. But right there at the Marine Drive station, we think there's a real opportunity to build a lot of industrial space, about 6 times what's there today, and then add in a really significant amount of rental housing and a large community amenity. And there's similar condition of BCC Clark Station, where we've got another development, and then there's other 2 throughout the regions that others are working on. I think that's a real opportunity. They're big sites to make a big move, and we just hopefully working with some of the industrial users are going to be able to change that discussion to recognize the real opportunity to have the 2 working together.
Yeah, it's well said. I agree with you as well. Knowing that area, South Vancouver, I guess you could call it. You look at all that industrial area, and they're all sort of 1 or maybe 2-story buildings. They take up a lot of land. They're needed. You know, those industries are needed because that's the kind of nuts and bolts of our economy. But to kind of like give up all that extra space above those floors seems a little bit of a waste.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the nature of that industrial job in the city of Vancouver is changing. You know, and our aspirations around the green economy and tech and digital media, all those things, that's an element of it. Apparel is a big element of it. Distribution. You know, the workers working in there isn't kind of the old school guy swinging a hammer necessarily.
That's right.
They value all the same things that, you know, workers in the office space do. They want amenities. They want to be living close to where they work. They want to be able to get on a train. Like, there's a really opportunity here to kind of treat that worker with a modern lens.
Yeah.
And I think that will really help support Vancouver's competitiveness in that really desirable economic space.
Well, you definitely know what you're talking about, and you're talking to a guy that this touches on, because aside from this, I actually have an EV charging business that I've launched.
Okay, well, there you go.
And we're looking for space, and we went down to the actually very close to the Marine Gateway area, and we were looking for some industrial property. But like our industrial, like we're not dealing with oils and hammers and stuff. We're just dealing with like EV charging units that we have to store that get shipped in from abroad, and then like tinker with them as they go out the door. But I need a combination. So I don't need a ton of industrial space, but I need enough to be able to house these things. But I also need office space because the guys that are working there are also working in an office, and then they need to have amenities, right? Like they got to be able to be close to a transit station, or they have to have parking. Like I'm amazed at these industrial spots, how little parking there is.
Yeah.
So I unfortunately had to turn away a lot of these because they just, the staff are going, well, where am I going to park? Where am I going to get lunch? Like where am I going to maybe drop off you talked about daycare. Where am I going to drop off my kids for daycare? So I love your terminology, integrated buildings or integrated facilities, because that truly is what we need to build to have a kind of a smart city, right?
Absolutely. But exactly what you're describing, I think, is bang on, because then you go back to the what you said earlier about kind of Vancouver's economy and the way we've done it. But Vancouver is a city of small business, and entrepreneurs, and we don't, and having that small bay industrial space in desirable areas is really important. And supporting that economy, having it be at a cost that's approachable for those businesses is really important. You can do that with significant residential density above. You take away that density, it's very difficult to build new buildings to the type of rents that those users need to see.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that conversation is going to change because it's been very rearview mirror looking to this point.
Yeah. Well, this is good. Well, we need to have conversations like this so that people can hear it. And keep doing what you're doing. So we have Tim Grant, president of PCI Developments. Thank you for coming on Coastal Front today. This has been a great conversation. Keep up the great work and the amazing projects. I mean, all those buildings that you've built so far. I've been to most of them. They're wonderful, beautiful buildings. So keep doing what you're doing. It's excellent work.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you guys for what you're doing. It's a neat initiative you guys have.
Yeah, thank you. Tim Grant, president of PCI Developments.